for over 10 years. He has expertise in a broad range of forest management projects and provides services for a diverse portfolio of clients, including non-industrial private landowners, TIMOs, federal and state agencies, Native American tribes, county governments, conservation districts, and other private natural resource firms. He has a Bachelor of Science in Fire Ecology and Management from the University of Idaho. Greg.
Thanks everybody for joining us. We appreciate the opportunity to host this panel, and I think we're going to have a great discussion here for the afternoon. Like we said, the panel, we're going to talk about lumber and log market indicators and influences. I think particularly given a lot of the volatility at the federal level over the last 6 months in particular, you know, it's a really important topic to bring up here at a conference like this. So we're going to split it in two parts. The first part, we're going to talk about some past volatility and lead into, you know, sort of the current situation with what's going on, and we'll pause partway through and have some Q&A about that. And then the second part, we're going to shift and we'll talk about future indicators and predictions for what we might see, you know, going into the next 6 months or year and forward. So happy to introduce our three panelists and introduce Greg Latta. Greg Latta is a research associate professor of forest economics and the director of the policy analysis group at the University of Idaho. Dr. Latta's research focuses on the application of economic optimization models for policy analysis with extensive experience in forestry, land use, bioenergy, and climate policy domains. He holds a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of California at Santa Barbara, a master's degree in forest resources from Oregon State University, and a PhD in forest and resource economics from the Norwegian University of Life Sciences. Our second panelist is Todd Morgan. Todd Morgan is the director of the Forest Industry Research Program at the University of Montana's Bureau of Business and Economic Research. He received his Master of Science in Forestry from the University of Montana in 1999 and has a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy and Bachelor of Science in Forest Sciences from Penn State. Todd oversees a team of 10 employees at the Bureau working on a variety of research projects focused on timber economics across the Western United States. Todd is a certified forester and member of the Society of American Foresters. And our third panelist, Samuel Scott. Samuel is a forest economist with the Forest Industry Research Program at the University of Montana's Bureau of Business and Economic Research. His work is primarily focused on the structure and bioeconomic impact of the forest products industry across the United States, timber appraisal on public lands, and public outreach. Prior to working at the Bureau, Sam served as an economist at the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics and worked in timber and silviculture for both the USDA Forest Service and the U.S. Bureau of Land Management. He graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Forestry from the University of Montana and a Master of Science in Forest Economics from Virginia Tech. So go ahead, guys. Thank you.
All right, so we got the coveted after lunch talk. So a lot of you the people down there still eating, well, they'll just not get at it. So we wanted to liven it up a little bit, keep it maybe a little snarky and move it forward. So the topic was kind of tariffs and executive orders. You know, these are unprecedented times. It's just stuff going on like you wouldn't believe. And so we kind of came up with this changing past, changing future focus, which didn't really start that way. It started maybe with a meme going around from Men in Black, you know, when they're talking about how there's a spaceship out there that's going to blow up the earth, and that's just crazy. And then he says, relax, there's always a spaceship out there going to blow up the earth. So we broke the thing into two pieces. And the first one here is that the sky is falling. It's always falling. And we're going to look at the past. We're going to look at things that have gone on. Right, and one thing about when the sky's falling and being in forestry is that we make it through, right? And so the second part is there will be toilet paper. So, right, relax, nothing unprecedented going on. And so what we'll do is walk through big issues that we've seen that have been affecting markets in the past. We'll have a discussion, and then we'll move into the second part and hopefully keep it entertaining as we go as well. So with that, I will pass it along to Mr. Morgan.
All right. Thank you, Greg. Well, on the theme of things are always changing, the sky's always falling, of course, the 1990s were when we saw dramatic declines in federal timber harvest across the West, National Forest System, BLM. Then in the, I guess would it be the early 2000s, mid-2000s, was the housing bust, financial crisis, and private harvest, and production went way down. And so a little bit about what my program does at the Bureau. Well, I'll tell you about that right after we talk about this. No. So we do mill surveys throughout the western states. So we cover 12 states, all the way from Alaska down to New Mexico, and pretty much everything in between. And what we do in that work is we work real closely with the Forest Service, the Forest Inventory and Analysis Program. And part of what we're there to do is to understand how much demand there is for timber, where these mills are that use it, and in what different forms they use it. And so my first response, well, let me see what I can find about tribal mills and tribal harvest in our data. And, so like all things, it can be challenging to collect data from mills, not just from, say, tribal mills, but, wood products facilities around the West, probably around the country. Of course, these folks are always busy. They're pretty guarded with their information, particularly if you want to ask them about inputs and outputs in the same setting, same sitting. And then with the tribal issues, of course, there's the challenges with the sovereignty and the ability to say, well, we're not reporting that data. And it's like, we get it. We know there are a handful of tribal-owned mills throughout the West, or there are also mills that sit on tribal land that aren't necessarily owned by the tribes. I think Arizona, Alaska, certainly Washington and California are the 4 states that I know of without a doubt. And I would point out that, like all mills, these facilities are very important locally to accomplishing the land management treatments that people want to accomplish, to maintaining that rest of the forest industry infrastructure from the foresters, the loggers, the log haulers. It all depends on having some pull in that intermediate space, which is the mills, which then, of course, supply the market for construction or whatever. Let's see. Related to that, I had to do a little bit of homework to get ready for this, and the Indian Forest Management Assessment Team report that came out, I guess it was last year, was a great resource. The one thing I would say about it is that, boy, I wish it was produced more frequently than every 10 years. But it was a great resource. And for me, I thought it emphasized an important point that, our program and Greg's, we focus on wood products, on timber, but like many private landowners, timber is not always the top priority. In fact, as I read through the IFMAT report, I could see that it wasn't only not a top priority all the time, that sometimes it wasn't really a priority at all. But I would just like to remind folks that it's an important cultural resource, timber is, and it is a revenue potential to really help achieve the other land management objectives and reach those other land management priorities that the private landowner or tribal owner might want to accomplish. So just real quickly, I took a look at our data, and I was, all right, where are the states with the most tribal harvest? And it turns out that Alaska and Washington are the 2. I would say that both of these are likely to change. Alaska, we know that most of the native corporations are switching to more of the carbon market perspective. Their harvest is going down, has dramatically decreased. Alaska is also unique in terms of timber harvest in that roughly not only was a majority of it from Native Corp land, which was in itself very different than the other states in the West. But most of those logs were going to international export, which is very different from the rest of the Western U.S. Washington, there are definitely some plans on the table, I think, to see changes in state lands and maybe even some private lands related to extending rotations. So I think there's another possibility that we could see annual timber harvest volumes going down, at least in the short term. Collectively, tribal lands account for about 400 million board feet or less of timber harvest in the West each year. That would be in the neighborhood of 0.5% of the Western harvest. So again, it may not be the majority, but it's certainly locally relevant and locally important. And with that, I'll pass it back to you, Greg.
Oh, all right. So I was thinking of pulp and paper when I was doing it, right? So when you're harvesting, it's important to utilize as much of the material as you can, right? We want to get that stuff out. We want to get paid for it, and that can facilitate being able to manage more acres as you move along. So I was thinking of what were the 3 pulp and paper crises where the sky was falling recently, and these are the 3 that I came up with. So rise of the internet, right, and the end of printing and writing papers, and newsprint. Right? The other one's competition with pellets. So in some cases, when that capacity was going down, pellets were coming in and taking that over. And so that's a different perspective from a landowner in terms of pulp and paper. And then this last one was Trade War One, right? It dropped in recovered paper exports, cheap old corrugated cardboard, and what that means for our ability to sell virgin timber into markets. So this, sadly, is looking from 1970 to 2023 in terms of newsprint consumption in the United States. So we went from a period where, we were growing from anywhere in 10 million metric tons up through 13 million metric tons through 1990. We all used to have a newspaper laying in the front yard. It's where you got your information, right? But that hasn't been where it's coming from lately, right? When we used to look at future markets for newsprint and printing and writing papers, we used to relate it to GDP. And up until those 1990s, that was a good indicator of what was going to happen in pulp and paper markets with respect to newsprint, printing and writing papers, right? You'd look at GDP growth, we're more wealthy, we have more demand for newsprint. Population grows, we have more demand for newsprint. So we know what happened then in the 1990s. We also have data on the percentage of the population that has internet access. And so through those 1990s up through present, where it's almost 100% in the United States, we're a really high percentage, right? That is maybe how we're getting our news. And perhaps more importantly, when you're buying and selling stuff, you're not doing a classified ad and paying for that in a newspaper anymore. You're going onto Craigslist or Facebook Market or whatever it is. And so with that data, with that internet consumption going up, the GDP is actually a negative indicator of what's going on with pulp and paper when it relates to newsprint and writing papers. So when we do our projections going forward, so that's this little line down here, and we're looking out through 2040. There's about, if you look at this annual energy outlook that I'm using, which is our national projections, they have GDP and housing starts and things like that in there. There's about a 40%, a little less than 40% increase in GDP that'll go on over that time period. And that little blip that you can see it that goes down still is our expectations for newsprint. So not very rosy when we're looking out there, right? So not going to call it a crisis. That's kind of the thing we do these days, right? There's a newsprint crisis. No, there's not really a crisis, but it kind of sucks to be in the newsprint market. So that's kind of where that's going. That was a fundamental shift that remains to this day for printing and writing papers and newsprint. And, we're in a state right now that how many pulp mills? 6, 7, 0, right?
Montana, 0.
Yeah,
Idaho, 1.
Idaho, 1. So it's a tough market, and we're areas where you have a lot of fuel reduction people want to do. There is a lot of tribal activity and no real market for that unless you're close to those particular facilities. So that was one. Where that may have had a shining lining was in this increase in pellet markets. So EU policy was looking at biomass. This is largely going to a company, Drax, in the UK, where they're burning it and making electricity. And so this is the U.S. South, and these are big pellet mills that went in the U.S. South, which was nice because it was going in at the time that pulp was declining. So from a landowner perspective, if you're selling logs, that's a good thing, right? You still have a market to do it. But it's another thorn in the side of the pulp industry in that now you've got these pellet mills. Maybe they can't pay quite as much as you, but they're competing with you for that material out on the landscape. So further hitting that pulp market. And so when you look at the number there on the graph, that's the exports out of the country, mostly to the EU in terms of pellets. We have a little action maybe here on the West Coast looking at Japan, Drax, and then there's a company in Longview and maybe another one in Grays Harbor going to Japan. But, right, that's about 8 million metric tons. So it kind of covers the newsprint, not so much the graphics paper, but that's kind of where we sit until 2017. So first Trump administration, right, we put tariffs on China, and China responded by putting a ban on recovered paper. So they said, we're not going to take your trash anymore. And that is that graph going up from 1970. You get in there, we're exporting somewhere around 20 million tons of recovered paper to mostly China. As of 2017, the market's shifted, right? We still have some going to Southeast Asia, but a lot of it then is staying in the country. And so that 8 million going up in terms of pellets, we have 8 million here almost of extra recycled paper in the United States waiting around for us. So what happens, right? Consumption didn't change. We use the same stuff largely that we used before, right? There's just more recovered paper domestically. So when exports dry up, you package that stuff up and it gets used within the country. So there's been investment in pulp and paper, which we hadn't seen a bunch of in a while, but if you look at these facilities that are doing it, it is investments in making paper with that recycled fiber that's here. So it doesn't really help us out in terms of the future. So those are my three shocks in pulp and paper, right? Newsprint, the internet, that was pretty damaging, right? We have pellets coming in and maybe hitting us a little, not as bad, and then we have this recovered paper shift and low prices for OCC, or the old corrugated cardboard that people can use in place of virgin fiber. So sky fell a bit on pulp and paper, fell hard here in Montana, fell pretty hard in Idaho too, but we move on. And with that, we move on.
Awesome. Thank you, Greg. Are you guys sick of graphs yet? All right, that's what I wanted to hear. Also, bumping off of what Todd said, as far as our data collection from mills, I did look at the attendee list, and I did see a number of you on that list that are also in our mill list. So if you have any questions, come find me, or Todd, or Ben, who's back there. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the last few years in housing markets, as well as kind of price volatility, both for logs and lumber, and kind of look at things in a couple different perspectives. And I think when we're talking about the sky is falling and shocks and like kind of how we got to where we are, we really don't have to go that far into the past, especially from the demand side, looking at the housing side. If we take the last, say, 5 years, I think the natural starting point to tell the story, maybe, there we go, is to start with inflation, because this really kind of frames a lot of what is going on. And here I've got kind of a CPI, which is an inflation indicator. You may like it, you may hate it, but it's commonly used. And we can see that kind of extreme inflation in the early days of the pandemic, going up until kind of mid to early 2022, and then we see it decline. What's one thing that changed during that period that led to that decline? And that would be interest rates, right? And those changes from the Federal Reserve affect all sorts of interest rate and lending markets. But in particular, because we're talking about the wood products industry, we're interested in mortgage rates because a lot of wood goes into houses and buildings. So we can kind of see that point where those two lines cross. That's where we had an increase in interest rates and a decrease in inflation. So it seemed like it worked for the most part. It's still a little bit sticky. You know, the Fed kind of shoots to get closer down to 2% than it is right now. But what we really care about from the wood product side is how that impacts the demand for wood. And one common metric we use to look at kind of aggregate demand for wood are single-family housing starts in the United States. That's not all wood consumption. It's somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 50% of lumber consumption in the U.S. goes into new housing starts. So it's not the entire market, but it's very measurable. We have pretty good numbers on it, and it represents a significant portion of the market. So it's one we look at a lot. So let's go ahead and look at that relationship between mortgage rates and single-family home starts over that same period. We see that kind of decrease in the early days of the pandemic. That's where we couldn't get materials, we couldn't get labor. Do you guys remember there was a big boat that got stuck in the Suez Canal? Anybody remember that? Yeah, there was a lot going on. Those was a long time ago, right? And then we saw that increase, kind of those as people moved around the country, especially from urban areas to more rural areas, as we all know about in the West. And then things kind of plateaued. We see that green line kind of level out in early 2021, and then we see it decrease when mortgage rates go up, which is precisely what we'd expect, and that's kind of the point of raising mortgage rates, right, is to cool off spending a little bit, to bring aggregate demand down so it's more in line with aggregate supply, and it helps knock away at some of that inflation. And we did see that. We see the decrease. But not long after that, those mortgage rates are still up, 6, 7, 8%, double or triple what they were, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. But we see housing start to recover, and they come back up. And that's something that's pretty interesting. If I extend this graph back, a couple decades, it's not often that we see housing starts climb without interest rates coming down. This was kind of an interesting time for that to happen. Now, there's a lot of noise in this, though, because we're just looking at the pure level. So kind of one other way to look at it is to put things into kind of a percent growth, kind of that year-to-year, year-over-year change, kind of a volatility metric. And that's what that would look like there. And that's a little bit more clear of kind of where we are and where we've been over the past 5 years, right? We've kind of got this sinusoidal up and down curve that we're in. And the reason we're talking about this in relation to the wood products market is because we think of housing starts as a key indicator of demand for wood products, right? And I apologize, this is going to be Western U.S. biased because that's all I know about. So. So if we think about that change in demand over that period, in a healthy or in a competitive marketplace in kind of the textbook Econ 101 market, we'd expect to see production of whatever good we're looking at respond to that demand change, right? So in years that housing demand is growing, we would expect to see lumber production grow as well. In years that housing demand is declining, we expect to see a decline in lumber production as well. So starting off with just 3 big western states, we'll do Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. We see that's kind of true, right? For the most part, in years that that dark line is above the 0 mark, most of the bars are also above the 0 mark. And the same is true, especially going the other way. And that's kind of what we'd expect to see, right? But interestingly, as we move further inland and into smaller markets, and I think this is really key, is just kind of the size of our marketplace here in Montana is pretty small. Things look a little bit different in the interior. So really what we're getting at here is, we talk about national demand for wood products and kind of these big, broad, sweeping terms, as well as timber supply in kind of these big, broad, sweeping terms. But it's definitely not a, rising tide lifts all boats kind of situation. It really depends on where you are. These marketplaces are very different. While lumber is generally sold as a national commodity and responds to kind of macroeconomics and what's going on with, international policy and mortgage rates and all that kind of stuff, the supply side of the wood products market is pretty hyper-regional or even local, depending on where you are, right? Like, timber can only travel so far once it's off the stump to get to a mill. So if a particular region is facing, whether it's a fiber supply issues or labor supply issues tied with housing or whatever's going on in that area, natural disaster, whatever it is, there's friction between that national demand and that regional supply. So often when we talk in these broad terms, it doesn't really tell the whole story of how we got here. So if we think about that, those lumber markets again, and again, we're thinking about that friction between national supply national demand and regional supply. Here we've got national lumber prices. This is the Random Lengths framing lumber composite price, right? It's got a weighted average mix of products that are commonly used for framing lumber in the United States. It's generally what we talk about when we talk about, lumber's up 4% or whatever. Generally, we're talking about this framing composite price put out by Random Lengths. And we see over that same period of the past 5 years, these big swings. Now, interestingly, if I were to take this graph basically as far back as I could, I don't know, maybe the French-Indian War, this spike would still show up. This is unique, what we went through with lumber prices during the pandemic. Going from $400 a thousand to $1,600 a thousand is unique. We haven't really seen anything like that in the past, so we don't really have many points of comparison. But we can see that things have kind of settled down. This only goes to the end of 25. I didn't put in the past 6 months, but we'll talk about that a little bit when we get to it. So back to that idea of kind of the perfect market we learned about in Econ 101 versus these kind of regional versus national markets that we really live in. Following that perfect model, we would expect log prices to follow lumber prices to some extent. Like the natural process would be lumber prices go up because something happened in national demand. Sawmills see an increased lumber price. They want to take advantage of it, so they increase production. In order to increase production, they're going to need more logs, so the demand for logs goes up. And log supply can only respond to a limited extent because of the nature of forestry and timber, and trees take time to grow. So we'd expect that spike in demand for logs with that relatively short-term fixed supply of logs to increase the price of logs over that period. But let's take a look at a couple different regions, a couple different log prices, and see how that actually plays out. So this is the Montana delivered log price, just as kind of a weighted average as we collect it quarterly from mills across Montana during that period. And here we see kind of precisely what we were talking about, how because of regional issues, we don't see that respond to national demand. Basically, mills didn't increase production. In fact, lumber production went down in Montana during that time while lumber prices are going up, which is kind of counterintuitive, right? So why would mills pay more for logs if they're making the same amount of lumber or less lumber than they were making before? They're not going to need logs anymore than they did before, and the price for logs they're not willing to pay anymore, right? And now we have another log source we can compare to as well. Our neighbors to the west here in Idaho, actually Northwest Management. Thank you, Greg. They collect delivered log prices from mills in Idaho, and they kind of release a weighted average number similar to what we do, and that's that blue line that you can't really tell is there because it's going right along with the green line. And in this case, Idaho and Montana are really in that same boat. I will say, too, there's some differences in how these two lines we're looking at now and the next two lines are collected, kind of the methods. These two are collected from mills. The next two lines we're going to look at are essentially transactional data from mills that are reported directly to RISI log lines, the same folks that do Random Lengths. So it's a little bit different source. There's a couple other differences, and I want to talk about them. But just looking, right now, we're really just looking at the volatility here is the most important part and kind of the response to that change in lumber prices. So let's go to two big markets on the West Coast, Washington and Oregon. And there we do see some movement, right? We see some change with those spikes in lumber prices. Now, the price level difference between these two isn't nearly as important as the changes between the two. There's a few differences that are really important here. The first is those Washington and Oregon prices that use a different logs. They use a different log scale. They're using West Side Scribner, so you know there's 15% of that volume of that price difference is accounted for by the difference between those log scales. They're also different species. Log lines, Reese log lines. They're looking at Doug fir logs on the coast, which are a high value product. With a lot of different possibilities. But another big difference is just the market size, that there's a lot more competition and a more perfect market on the West Coast. So these effects that you'd expect to see from kind of that Econ 101 standpoint are a little bit more apparent in markets with more competition. But we have one more source, because all these come from the sawmill side. But there's also one group that collects prices from the loggers, and this would be the Bureau of Labor Statistics for the Producer Price Index. They contact loggers and ask them about their received prices. They put it into a national index. So that is this line here. They do it monthly rather than quarterly, which is why these seasonal trends show up. And I want to point out here that this is an index, not a price, right? Because it's all sorts of different products all across the country. So I fixed the starting point at $400 a thousand just so we could compare it to the others. But PPI doesn't actually measure it in a dollar value. It's an index value. But so I think when we look at this, it's kind of hard to tell what's going on because the orders of magnitude are so different. But if we take a look at just the volatility of those four lines, starting with Oregon, on a percent change basis, we see quite a bit of volatility, right? Let's go to a state that's slightly smaller in market size. We'll see a little less volatility. Let's step down again. So to put these into perspective, Oregon harvests something like 4 billion board feet of timber a year. Washington harvests something like 3 billion board feet of timber a year. Idaho's right around the 1 billion mark, maybe 1.2 billion, and we see less volatility. And then all the way down to Montana, we harvest, well, we used to be able to say we harvested 300 million. It's more like 200 million now. And we see we're kind of in that same boat as Idaho. So it's definitely in that, the regionality of the supply side of the wood products chain is really important to understand, that it's all not just national lumber prices. But log costs aren't the only costs that wood products manufacturers face or the trends that we care about. So if we extend a little bit longer out here and we look at the past 10 years, starting with that delivered log cost, right? So one way to think about a sawmill is it's a simple model for a sawmill would be it's a facility that combines labor with logs to produce lumber, right? Those are the two biggest inputs, the two biggest factors of production in a sawmill. The two biggest costs are logs, purchasing logs, and paying for labor. So if we look at that delivered log cost in Montana on a percentage change basis here, we see it hasn't really changed, this is in nominal terms, hasn't really changed since 2013 on this scale. Realistically, it's gone up 10 or 15% since 2013, which doesn't look like a lot on this scale, but if you're running a business and half of your cost goes up 10% and you're already on a very thin margin, that's a big difference to you. But we can't really show that here because we have to have kind of an obnoxious y-axis here, and we're about to see why. So we talked about logs, but the other key input sawmills deal with is labor. So if we look at this as average labor cost over that same period, this is where we see some really big change, right? In nominal terms, looking at BLS QCW data, in nominal terms, labor costs are 75% higher per worker now than they were in 2013. Of course, this is a big reason we're seeing such a big move towards automation in our mills. I was at the SPI mill in Shelton, Washington in December. Just a massive, massive stub mill. And walking around there, I couldn't find anybody. There was 4 people in the whole building. And this is really why we're seeing that transition is the increase in per worker labor costs. But through the pandemic, through this period here where we're seeing both of those rise, you can see how that would put sawmills in a tough situation. So why did we see, especially in Montana, especially in the interior West, why did we see mill closures happening at the end of the pandemic rather than during this period of super high costs while they were rising? Well, those super high lumber prices were offsetting that the short-term increase in lumber prices was offsetting inflation in the short term of those key inputs. So now lumber's back down where it was. Right now, lumber's at 2013 levels. It's at that, sub $400. Well, it changes almost every day right now, which we can talk about. But in that kind of sub $400 level. So now prices are back down to where they were for lumber, but your costs are significantly higher than they were before the pandemic, kind of leaving you in a tight spot. Greg?
Back to me for the other boogeyman that have been getting us in the past, so carbon, of course. So I broke carbon into 3 eras for you here. Era 1, if you're old enough to remember and play in this market, there was a brief flirtation with the Chicago Climate Exchange in the 2000s. Right, we had prices go up, prices come down, there was no additionality, it disappeared. So era 2, I call the California ARB gold rush, with gold, of course, being payments for carbon stocks. And so that's when we had a lot of carbon projects start in. But you could argue a lot of those weren't going to harvest at the levels that they said they were going to harvest at anyways. And the other thing that it did is when you incentivize these stocks, you incentivize holding high stocks in potentially high fire risk areas. And so that's where, of course, we have seen tribes participate. We have seen them have issues, Warm Springs being one, Colville being another, right? There's multiple examples of where the focus on stocks led to potentially a failure in that particular market. Right, so what we're looking at here is somewhere around 6 million acres that we have involved in that market. It's evolved, so coming off that gold rush, right, we're now in kind of coming of era 3 here. And it's kind of, I have chaperones needed for the market. And so there's been a lot of volatility, there's been a lot of issues and a lot of press, and so we come in with the watchdogs, and so this is the Integrity Council, right, wanting us to have better rules. We now have ratings agencies, this is B0, so carbon projects will get things like a B, a B+, a C, a D rating, depending on how they fare, and buyers are looking at that sort of thing, and Calyx is another one that does that, so project gets an A, and it'll tell you different ways that it's doing it. So the carbon market is changing. You can argue that maybe it affected local harvest levels in some case, but if you're also arguing that it wasn't additional, right, you can't have both. It either was stopping harvest or it was not additional. Right, the other one that hit, of course, was bioenergy, and so bioenergy I have here, just it works as long as the subsidy lasts, right? Bioenergy is nothing new. Forest industry's been using bioenergies as long as possible. So, right, academia, we look at things like the rise and fall of bioenergy. Renewable gets a big F for how it's doing things when you look at that, and then these plants are closing. So a lot of these are the pellet mills that I was showing you in the other graph that were taking some of that fiber that would have been in pulp and paper. They've started to close, whether it's a pellet mill here in Mississippi or whether it's a never open 300 million biofuel facility in South Central Oregon. Right, as soon as the subsidies go away, the market collapses in terms of what's going on with bioenergy. And so with that.
So that'll bring us up through past. We've talked a lot about past volatility, ways that that's tracked in the market, and a lot of the reasons that we've sort of gotten to the point where we're at today. So we want to pause here and have 10-ish minutes or so for questions and answers, and we want to try to have the discussion focus on, we've talked about all of these past crises, And we want to talk about, hopefully we can get some questions about what's different with the current situation we're in. Why our situation now is different from those past crises. And then after a few questions, we'll finish out with a discussion about the tariffs and their impact and so forth. So if there's questions, I know there's a couple mics around the room. And if you have a specific panelist you want to direct those to, go ahead.
It's Alex with Fond du Lac Forestry. I have a question about it was mentioned that the bioenergy, like without the subsidies, it wouldn't necessarily be economically feasible. Is that because of the needed infrastructure to essentially have facilities to process bioenergy? Or is there some other cost that the subsidies also offset and are necessary for?
So I'm guessing that's me. So a lot of it is what you're selling. So if you're selling power and power goes at 6 or 4 cents a kilowatt hour, there's not a lot of margin there. And if you're doing it with forest sources to get the kind of volumes you need to have a facility that has any kind of impact, you're going to be drawing it in from a pretty far distance. Right? So it works well in agricultural systems, bamboo, miscanthus, things that you can plant a crop that has an annual harvest that's close to a facility. That works better. When it's harvests on a land base where we harvest out here, every 50, 60 years in the South, you're pulling stuff off on a faster rotation still, but it's the transportation step. There's no margin for it as an energy source alone. So as soon as you pull the plug on a subsidy that I'm going to subsidize you 3 cents a kilowatt hour, it starts to have a hard time actually penciling out, and things will just kind of drop off.
Okay, so that's based on more of the transportation costs then. You mentioned that annual crops maybe have more of a potential for that. Which track would some of the fast-growing hybridized aspen follow in terms of, because those are, at least in Minnesota, some of those are harvested on 15 to 25-year rotations. Does that make them closer to the 45-year rotation plus trees, or does that make them closer to the miscanthus?
You're not going to get to the miscanthus with aspen growth, period. That stuff grows very fast. So I don't know. I mean, when I look at aspen areas, when I look at, say, Minnesota, I can, there's been plants that have gone in there and plants that have collapsed, right? There aren't a lot of great shining examples of bioenergy facilities that start up with a subsidy policy and when it drops that remain kind of viable as they go through to date. If you do have an example, it's kind of it can be an outlier in some cases. So I'm not saying that that's a bad example. The nice thing about the miscanthus or an annual crop is that every year it's the exact same acre that you're pulling it out of, and the biomass per unit per acre per year is usually quite a bit higher than what you can get, even on a kind of a coppice type system or whatever you're doing. Right? It's tough to make it pencil out.
Okay, thank you.
So on the graphs, you referenced lumber pricing. Is that lumber or is that logs? Because, I mean, there was a marketing and branding study ITC did about 12-ish years ago. Because there had been such a reduction in milling infrastructure in the West, we'd seen essentially log prices stay flat, but more variability between lumber prices, so boards and plywood. Just wanted to get a little explanation about that. Is that reflected in these, or is there a more significant difference in what we're seeing in finished products versus logs going into the mill?
Yeah, definitely. That's a great question. Yes, lumber prices are more volatile than log prices. And I think it's pretty clear here. If you look at, I should have explained this better. The gray bars are the national lumber price. And then those 4 different lines are different log prices collected from different places. So especially if you look at Idaho and Montana, it's precisely that, where lumber goes from $400 to $1,600, but log prices stay at $400. And that's, in a lot of ways, exactly, that's a function of market size and the available infrastructure to respond to those changes in lumber price, absolutely.
So our presenters this morning talked about these, new federal regulations saying that there's going to be a 25% increase in timber harvest. You commented on harvest going down in both Alaska and Washington. Is there a disconnect there, or is, a decreasing harvest, is that a reflection of prices, or is that a reflection of the fact that there is not actually demand for an additional 25% harvest from federal lands?
That's a great question. The harvest decline that I referred to in Alaska and potentially in Washington was related specifically to tribal lands. And in Alaska, it has a lot to do with the policy shift of the native corporations going away from timber harvesting and moving into the carbon market as part of it. There's probably an inventory-related issue there, too, as to what forest inventory they still have. The 25% increase that we've heard about coming from the National Forest System, and this will kind of lead into the next part of this conversation, is, one, we have to understand what is federal harvest, or let's look at National Forest harvest in particular. So in the western states, it's about 1.6 billion board feet annually. And so a 25% increase, assuming that 25% increase is across the board, and it would be roughly 400 million board feet a year increase. And that 400 million board foot number, coincidentally, is roughly equivalent to what tribal lands are currently harvesting or have been harvesting over the last 10 years, average, I'd say. So the 25% increase is not a gigantic number. I've heard it said that 25% of zero is still zero, but I wouldn't call the National Forest harvest zero, but it has been approaching it for a long time. Is it a good time to lead into the next set of slides, or do we want to let me dig a hole deeper for myself?
No, I think that's a great transition. So let's, if we got more questions, we'll hold them until the end.
Do we have one more?
Oh, one more right now? Okay, one more, and then we'll switch.
Sorry to hold it up. For the subsidies that are not working out so well for bioenergy, it seems like one policy solution could be to only subsidize one-time costs instead of operational costs, so that people don't build it into their business plan and fall out when the subsidy goes away, or make sure the subsidies are super reliable and consistent like they are in agriculture. Can y'all think of anything in the middle that, because those are two pretty extreme solutions that would be pretty hard to manifest?
Yeah, it is interesting you bring up agriculture. So I go around, I talk to loggers a lot, and it's one of the things I often bring up is just how different they are from the people in agriculture. They dress the same, right? They would look exactly like you sitting in this room, but in agriculture, if you say you have a subsidy, they'll jump at it, right? It's kind of like luring fish up. If you do the same thing in forest circles, they will shy away from you and shrink in terms of the subsidies. I think it's a cultural thing within the forest industry to be wary of subsidies, whereas in agriculture, it's not the case. I think if you could normalize it like you have in agriculture, then maybe you have a shot of having it, but we just don't have that system set up currently. I do like the idea of paying for big things up front, I would have loved to seen that with the Inflation Reduction Act, buying equipment, machinery, capacity, investing in new students to get more people working and that sort of thing would have been great. But anyway, I'll leave it at that.
I would just follow up to say maybe the form in which the subsidy could come would be in a different way, say a policy recognition that biomass energy is renewable energy, that it is sustainable when it's done correctly, and that that would actually come with a value that then could be incorporated into the market that would better enable biomass energy producers, whether it's liquid fuels, electricity, or solid fuels, to at least recognize some of that value in a different way.
All right, I'll get snotty on that one then. What I hate about the way that the government is looking at bioenergy and the sustainability of bioenergy in terms of carbon neutral bioenergy is they're looking at the stocks on the landscape. If the stocks on the landscape of forest are increasing, then bioenergy is good. If the stocks on the landscape are decreasing, then bioenergy is bad. And we in the West, we have a lot of negative stocks, right? They're going down. It's fire, it's overstocked, a lot of things going on, and that means that bioenergy for us is not necessarily in the same boat as it is in the South, down Alabama, Georgia, wherever you're going to do it, where their stocks are growing anyway. So it would be a different way of looking at that, I think, would be a good way to do it. So sorry, Sam.
No, you're good. I just have one quick comment that I think really goes into what Greg and Todd were both talking about, and that's the difference between agriculture and forestry. It's pretty well accepted in agriculture that what we all want, we want farmers to get high prices for their crops. We want a consistent and reliable food supply chain, but we don't want to pay very much in the grocery store. And if we think about that from a pretty basic economic standpoint, markets can't really do that. We can't pay low prices at the grocery store and get high prices for farmers, so we have a government in the middle. And that's pretty well normalized and accepted in agriculture, and I think it's a lot less accepted in forestry, even though our goals are pretty similar to that.
All right, thanks, guys. We'll transition to part two. We don't want to push time too bad into the break, so if we can move through it and focus on the tariff conversation, that would be great.
Spoiler alert, there will be toilet paper. But real briefly, I was going to try to touch on, all right, well, either way. Harvest predictions. Yeah, it doesn't get any better with pictures, folks. Harvest predictions. So there's a couple things that I don't think will be, wow, will be non-issues. Standing timber volume. I think we've kind of addressed this already, or that supply that's on federal lands, that it's abundant. It's across size and age classes. It's across species. That's not going to be an issue. Available milling capacity. That is also, again, for the western states, all 12 western states have available capacity at existing, currently operating mills. Somewhere in the neighborhood of an additional 3 billion board feet a year could be used by existing facilities in the West. So, yeah, there's plenty of trees. Yeah, there's plenty of mills. What are the limiting factors? And I would just say that these are things that we can see as being dealt with over time, maybe not in the next 4 months, or maybe in the next 4 years. I think NEPA-ready NEPA-ready shelf stock is going to be a challenge. Projects that are already through NEPA and ready to go, and then how many more are going to be able to come out in the time frame that we have. And I think part of that gets to the labor supply question, particularly on the Forest Service side or on the federal side. Labor is also an issue in the market side for loggers, truckers, and mill workers. Again, some of these things can be dealt with by efficiencies. Other things can be dealt with by changing timing. Market demand or market pull, right? We talked about the disconnect, but in general, if housing starts to increase, if home construction starts to increase, that should boost wood products consumption. That should lead to increased log consumption. One of the things I think that the agencies and that all landowners have control over is sale content and feasibility. And this is something that I think the agency, the Forest Service in particular, is renewing its focus on and understanding what it is that they're trying to sell and what there's a market for and the costs that go along with the two different things. Saw timber and biomass have very different values to purchasers. They also have very different cost structures. So a tree is not a tree. You think of a saw timber sized tree that's 16 inches DBH versus a bunch of 6-inch DBH trees. It takes a lot more activity to get the same volume of wood out of those 6-inch trees than out of one 16-inch tree. Other items that we constantly hear about being in challenges with timber sale appraisal gets into things like road packages. Why are we building roads that are a mile and a half to get to a 10-acre treatment? That seems like really maybe not the best choice sometimes. Brush disposal. Other kinds of restrictions, whether it's seasonal restrictions on entering because of wildlife or hunting or other recreation activities. I mean, are we really going to put recreation behind managing our forest in terms of reducing fire hazard? And then the other things I would say, like I call them add-ons. So requirements to wash equipment. These things represent costs to the operators, and they're not always reflected as costs in timber sale appraisal. And so that's where I think more education, more cooperation between the agencies, between the landowners, and understanding what it is that makes their sales more or less attractive to potential buyers is important. And then the last thing I'd say, limiting factor would be location. And where are we going to see an increase in timber harvest? Where does the majority come from? I think the South, Region 8 is pretty available. The PNW, I don't know about Region 5 in California as much, but I think Region 6, again, higher volumes per acre, a lot more opportunity there to see increases that will get to that 25% increase nationally faster. The interior West states, Regions 1 through 4, may be more challenging. Fire hazard certainly is still an issue. Timber volumes, availability of people, more of an issue. And in the East, Region 9, that's an area that, even though I grew up there, I know desperately little about national forests in the Northeast. So, I'm not an economist, so I can make predictions, and I just use a crystal ball. So I will say the federal harvest will increase because of policy actions, right? The executive orders for timber protections, the one related to threats from imports, it's going to help increase harvest. Legislative fixes, administrative rule changes that we're seeing, those things should go away, go a ways toward enabling more harvest more quickly. Things like the Farm Bill, the proposed fix to the Cottonwood, the Fix Our Forest Act, the Wildfire Protection Act. There's been several court decisions, including a Supreme Court decision on this, was it 7 County versus Eagle, something, yeah, regarding NEPA and deference to the agency, and that NEPA is a procedural law, not a substantive one. I think these policy things are going to be initiatives that can make a difference if the agencies, the Forest Service, the BLM, the BIA are able to streamline NEPA and gain other internal efficiencies that will increase harvest. And that there's, I think, a great deal of faith that more work is going to be completed by G&A partners, whether that's states or tribes. My other crystal ball says that federal policy issues are going to cause harvest to decrease. The workforce has gone down. Partners, the states or the tribes don't have the money or the people to do the work. There's labor issues. There's going to be environmentalist backlash. Underlying economic conditions like relatively high inflation, still higher interest rates, housing costs being high, and labor supply are still fundamental issues that the policy we've seen so far hasn't changed. And so, yes, it will go up and it will go down on federal lands. And I think, so what does that mean for private landowners, tribal landowners, I think they're going to be able to respond to the market signals as they have more quickly and more readily than their federal counterparts. So let's get into tariffs. Everybody wanted to hear about.
Class is back in session. We're going to talk about tariffs. While we talk about tariffs, kind of tariffs in general are this broad term that really applies to a lot more than what we typically talk about. But really, it's just kind of any government intervention as a trade barrier between two countries is the broadest definition of a tariff. So a tariff could be an export tax. Most of the time we talk about it as an import tax, but it could be a lot of different things. It could be quantity quotas. It could be a lot of different things. But a duty is a specific type of tariff that is an import tax. And the duty we're kind of concerned about 3 duties right now within the wood products industry. And it pretty much all has to do with Canada. And the objective of any duty is quite simply to increase the price of foreign goods. It can be for a variety of reasons, whether that's something kind of more policy or principle based, or you're trying to retain a specific industry. Kind of whatever the bigger objective is, the mechanism through which a duty works is always to increase the price of the foreign good. So what we're dealing with right now, the first duty we're going to talk about is called a countervailing duty. So these are taxes specifically targeted at offsetting subsidies of a foreign government. So in the case of Canada, it's the discussion that timber off of crown lands, that would be the federal lands in Canada, the stumpage, the price of that timber is lower there than the price of stumpage here, and because it's coming from public lands, that is a subsidy from the federal government of Canada, and we want to offset that to help improve the wood products industry here. Right now, that countervailing duty is at 8%. A year and a half ago, it was at 4%, so it about doubled in August of last year. And then there's talk this year of it doubling again. But we also combine that with another type of duty, which is an anti-dumping duty. And really, these two duties are kind of focused at the same thing, but they're slightly different justifications. So dumping is the action of a foreign country that can produce something cheaper than you can domestically, and they increase their production and lower their prices to get to the point that your domestic industry can't compete with it, and that keeps going until you no longer have the domestic industry to provide that good or service, and now you're dependent on that foreign country, and then they can do what they want. So again, this really goes back to stumpage on crown lands. It's essentially the same effect happening, but slightly different justifications. That duty right now is at 6% with Canada. Once again, it was half that about a year and a half ago. In August, it went from 3-ish% to 6-ish%. So we often combine these two, and this is what we talk about when we talk about the Canadian softwood lumber tariff is actually the combination of these two different duties. They're kind of interesting, though. They don't get applied like a typical import tax. They kind of get retroactively charged. So an importer of record essentially makes a deposit when the lumber crosses the border, and then at the end of the year there's a review, and depending on what company what Canadian company that lumber came from, they're kind of reassessed a duty rate and then either sent a refund or an additional bill. But right now, the other tariff we're talking about are kind of these general tariffs that seem to be on or off every day. And not to get too far into the administration and its policies, but just more talk about the magnitude of tariffs we're talking about. And as far as we understand, if there were to be a general tariff with Canada, for lumber, it would be in addition to the two duties that we're already applying to Canada. So, right now we're at that kind of 15-16%. If we were to add 25% to that, we're looking at 39%. And 39% is significantly larger than 16%, especially when we look at the behavior of markets. And like I said, just to make it clear, the objective of this is to increase the price of foreign goods. That's good for mills. It's bad if you purchase wood in the U.S., though. There's always kind of winners and losers in all these things. So if we look at the history of those two combined, the countervailing and the anti-dumping duties in the United States, we can see they've kind of gone up and down over the past 20 years. The period between 2007 and 2013, I'm just showing that as 6% here. It was actually highly variable during that time, and it was more a quantity issue that assigned the rate, but that was kind of the median rate or the average rate during that time. We see here we're at 16%. There's talk this year of going up to 30-ish%, and we can see that's the highest it's been in the past 20 years. And then if we were to expand that graph even higher and include a general tariff, we can see we're pretty quickly getting into territory that we haven't seen before, and we're not really sure what those impacts will be. I can put lumber prices here right now. It's not super informative, which is what you'd expect. Sometimes I get the idea that people are thinking that, you know, a 20% tariff would increase the price of a good 20%, and that's not really how it works, especially with the domestic lumber prices. So kind of the studies that are out there look more into that range of like 10 to 20% increase in tariffs, or a 10 to 20% tariff with an elasticity of 0.2. So what that would mean is a 20% tariff would lead to a 2% increase in domestic lumber prices. So mills in the United States will be, you know, receiving an additional $8 a thousand if the lumber price is $4. But I haven't seen any studies looking at anything over 20%. So it's kind of outside what we've dealt with before and relatively unprecedented. So we're really kind of not sure what's going to happen with that. I think there's also some issues with the threatened tariffs being higher. I think even the threat of a tariff can move markets. I think right now, over the past few months, we've seen pretty volatile lumber prices, and there's kind of two things happening in two different directions, right? We've got these applied tariffs. We had the increase in duties. Then we have the threat of tariffs, and those are both driving lumber prices up. Then we have, you know, a significant portion of the population preparing for a possible recession. So we're seeing a decrease in some demand for wood products, whether that's housing or what have you, and that's driving lumber prices down. So we're really in a volatile moment right now with kind of forces going in two different directions. But the impact of a tariff or a duty is really dependent on where you are, what products you make, what species you make, and it comes down to how substitutable whatever you're making is by some Canadian producer. So if you're making, say, Vigas and Latillas in the Southwest is a good example, going to be relatively unaffected by tariffs because the Canadians don't make them, so there isn't really much of a substitution effect there, right? So it's another case, I'll say it again, of kind of a rising tide doesn't lift all boats.
All right, and then after we said that carbon and bioenergy were boogeymans of the past, there are also kind of things we're looking in the future. But one of the things I wanted to point out is this is kind of carbon credit era 4 we're in it now. So over on one side you have Meta and EFM and actually Microsoft involved in that as well. So there's big 70,000 acres on the Olympic Peninsula on that one that was purchased. Middle, right, Weyerhaeuser. So you can go and shop at any of those. Razorback, which is one of the ones in small print you probably can't read in Arkansas, is a property they bought, in part kind of looking at that. There was one for sale there. And then, of course, J.P. Morgan, Campbell Global, they're buying 250,000 acres. And, of course, looking at carbon as one of the streams that you get off of that. The difference this time around is the players in it. And we've called all of these credits improved forest management in the past, but for the most part, they were deferrals. And deferrals have been something that's hard to sell. That was kind of before we got to the chaperones being needed, that was us hitting deferrals real hard. Now it's going to be, how do you actually grow trees faster? How do you have both fast growing, culmination MAI, right, managing to actually increase carbon and produce products? What do you do to keep the industry thriving in those areas? And I think that's kind of where we'll be And the projects that you have, you're going to have a buyer already lined up. So it'll be like that EFM Meta project. You'll have the money in hand as part of what you do to actually purchase that. And you're going to be doing it in a way that you hope does not affect timber supply as you're going forward. Bioenergy, again, we talked about subsidies. I don't think you need it. So the first thing you'll notice is in the carbon one, there's no federal government involved in that. That's a private market. We're not even talking in those credit systems about selling within the ARB market, right? That's going to be voluntary, and it's to companies like Meta, like Microsoft, like Amazon, that are looking to improve their greenhouse gas situation. So this is another one here, the little circle on the bottom. This is $1.4 billion being invested by Microsoft in Louisiana for BECCS, what we call biomass energy with carbon capture and storage. So trees pull the carbon out of the atmosphere, we take it to a facility, we burn it, make energy, we pump the carbon underground, and it's stored there in a well. So it's a little different when I was talking before in that with Microsoft coming with the money up front, they've de-risked some of this in Louisiana and looking at it. And this is just one. I think they had another one that was $800 million. So that's $2.2 billion that they're investing into bioenergy in areas where pulp and paper capacity has fallen. All right, so there's another one in there. So that's that other one. And it's not just down there in Louisiana. You also have this alder renewables, bioenergy. Right? These, again, are not necessarily focused on government subsidies or the government. It is trying to develop a market that actually can take this thing through and survive an administration change. And so that's something that I think we're really going to be looking at, whether it's sustainable aviation fuel, whether it's BECCS. Those are both things that companies need in order to try to meet their greenhouse gas targets as you go. So I'll hit at this one at the end, maybe a little snarky on the way out. I think it'll do better if you keep government out in the future and you're looking at bioenergy and you're looking at these investment opportunities. Executive orders and administration changes are probably the worst thing that you can have going on. It doesn't create stability that you need to be able to generate kind of mobility in a market. And so to the degree that we can do it without the federal sources of funding, I think that increases the viability of those projects going forward, which gives more options for people to invest in your timberlands as they're going as well. So we'll leave it at that.
Thank you. All right, we can open it back up for questions and answers. We got right around 15 minutes.
Thank you. Jake Gibbs with the Cow Creek Umpqua Tribe from Roseburg. Question on demand for wood products or energy in the future. I don't know if I saw anything, but could you speak to housing demand and energy demand going forward as we're looking for reasons to use wood products?
Sure, I guess I can start off with housing. There's kind of two things going on. The first I alluded to, unsurprisingly, with a graph, and that is, even though we saw that increase in mortgage rates, we saw housing starts rebound. And I think if you talk to a housing specialist, a housing economist, they'll be talking about a lot more volatility than I do. They'll be looking at month-to-month projections and permits and starts, and they'll see a lot of changes, a lot of things going up and down. But if we broaden the scale a little bit, and we look kind of over a couple-year span, the housing market's relatively strong right now. Like for the level that mortgage rates are at compared to where they were, they've tripled in the past 5 years. But housing starts have only gone down, 15%, 18%. We're really in a pretty good spot, kind of nationally, and especially in certain regions. There's a housing shortage, right? There's more people that want housing than what we have, and we're not building as fast as we're not building fast enough to keep up with that. So the demand for housing, I expect it to remain strong, kind of no matter what happens in the market. Even if we do see a bit of a decline, I don't project anything to be, kind of a Great Recession style massive drop in housing demand. But kind of on the more optimistic front too, or maybe this is the more fantasy front, as a wood products guy, I think there is an opportunity for wood products to expand into more than just single-family homes. I think right now with a lot of the wood products we see coming out, there's a big opportunity to expand into multi-unit dwellings and into commercial building, primarily through mass timber and some of these new products. And on top of that, all of the carbon benefits as far as harvested wood carbon and life cycle analysis and all that. So I think there's a real opportunity there as long as we know how to sell it for wood products to expand kind of no matter what building does.
Yeah, and the energy, Todd. The energy one, that is what's driving Microsoft and Meta right now. It's I won't say you guys, but in general, us, AI, OneDrive, cloud storage. I don't think when they started their original kind of expectations of what their greenhouse gas situation was to be to 2040, they had thought how that was going to change those server farms and the energy demands that they need. So that's been a rough one, really cranking it up. And of course, bioenergy is one way that you can kind of get there. So I don't see us weaning ourselves of that as we all kind of look at our phones as we're moving through, right? We're all part of that problem.
So I think so increasing energy demand in the future is something that we can expect. And tying into what Sam was saying, the housing picture is also one of longer term. I think we need to see more construction. The long-term average is 1.4 to 1.5 million new home starts a year, and we have been well under that number basically since the Great Recession. So there's a lot of pent-up housing that needs to come online to keep up with household formation, population changes, just turnover in housing that will eventually need to be met. And it's not just a U.S. issue, it's in other developed nations as well, that there is this kind of housing has been slowed down, but really there's a need for it, and people are recognizing that.
And as far as it relates to toilet paper, we're growing at about 1 million people a year. That's 2 million butt cheeks. Toilet paper looks good moving forward. So, right, that part looks good.
All right, I have a question about supply. Early in your presentation, you talked about the federal government lands, having a large supply of timber. Seems to me on a comment level, the federal government has a supply of large timber, but on the industry side, the industry is gearing up for small wood production. So it seems like we're going in opposite directions. Do you foresee that as an issue?
All right. I don't necessarily, it could be an issue, right? There are mills that are more adapted to small log technology, and there are mills that are better adept at using larger logs. And there is a market for every log. That log may not be, or that market may not be local to those logs. So that's a long way of saying that I think the diversity in that distribution of timber sizes is probably a good thing. It represents different opportunities for different players in the marketplace, whether you're a seller on the landowner side or you're a purchaser, say, on the mill side.
I got a question back here. Can you hear me? Over on this side. Joe Majewski with the Office Wildland Fire, and I appreciate your presentation today. Actually, I call myself a non-practicing economist. I do like the topic quite a bit. So I have a question on risk reduction projects. as far as risk reduction for wildland fire, et cetera. How would you see like the best way to wind those up, as in leveraging, say, fuels management, risk reduction, and commercial timber harvesting? Like, what would be your keys to success to kind of expand in that area going forward?
I have a quick thought while they think about it, because I'm gonna not answer the question, and just say, well, I think one key to it is a little less tangible than what you're looking for, and I think we need in some ways a philosophical shift in forestry and in the wood products industry, where kind of in the past we viewed sawmills as a facility that produces the lumber we need and the lumber we use, which is definitely an important function of a sawmill. But if we start shifting towards the idea of a sawmill being a disposal site for woody biomass rather than a producer of lumber, if we consider its ability to consume wood its primary function, I think it opens up a kind of a whole different world of possibilities where we start looking at it from the other side, almost how we'd view, a recycling plant or a wastewater treatment facility, kind of key infrastructure and utilities in rural communities. I think that's a decent starting point is changing how we think there. Do you guys have anything?
No, I don't really have anything. It's one of those things too where you want to do that isn't necessarily where you can utilize it. One of the concerns I would have on this 25% increase is if you pull the equipment off of an additional acre to generate your 25% increase, have you created kind of a net gain? I mean, we were talking about this at dinner last night, that it's the same people, right? You're just pulling people from one place, putting them into another place. We need to kind of add capacity. We need more people in the room. We need more equipment out there, whether we're paying for it. However, right, we can't just keep moving us around, and now I'm wearing my GNA hat, now I'm with IDL, now I'm working with the Forest Service, but I'm the same person, and I can only do so much work, so nothing additional happens. It's going to be tough, I think, to do that, but changing the mindset, like what is the value proposition of working in forestry? That's a tough one for kids. They love sustainability. We call things environmental science, and they'll sign up for it. Sustainable, they'll sign up for it. But they're not necessarily the things you're talking about. And so if we could get them that it's sustainable and environmental when you work on a forwarder, it's sustainable and environmental when you have a log truck, it's sustainable and environmental when you're setting up a pellet mill or doing some sort of biochar operation, right? It's industry, but it's working in those. And that's a mindset that I think needs to change to try to lure young people to do these sorts of jobs.
All right, we've got time for one more question.
This is Tim Miller from Grand Portage in Minnesota. I find that interesting, that your comment about treating a wood facility as like a recycle center, but recycle centers, at least that I'm familiar with, are heavily subsidized. And so with that, there needs to be a change in that part of the process as well. So that's an interesting idea. So anyway, just a comment.
All right, yeah, that was super quick. Let's go one more.
Cody Disdale, Executive Director for Caughville. So back to the carbon discussion, and Caughville's been a good example of where we've had unintentional reversals from wildfire, but the way the carbon protocols are developed now, it makes the assumption that any accruals on the landscape will stay on the landscape with the exception of what's in your buffer pool, but that's a one-time rating over a 100-year time frame. So what are your thoughts about how protocols should be changed in places that currently have carbon markets, particularly where there are compliance obligations? And if we ever get to a national standards, what that legislation might look like to ensure that the carbon we're growing on those landscapes we can retain on those landscapes, particularly in fire-adapted ecosystems.
So I'll bite on the last part of that first. Hopefully, if it's a national thing, it's voluntary, it's not through the federal government. USDA kind of waded in with these things. It was just noise last year. The new biomass equations, that was noise. I think they're getting better at doing the risk profiles in terms of what's going into the buffer pool. So you could look at, we won't take your project, maybe like a Green Diamond project or something like that. There was endemic fire, there were small fires that were going on all through the project where that's covered within the project as just reduced growth that you're getting over time. So the stocks maintain, growth is lower because you had, a couple 3,000 acre fires on a 400,000 acre property. It's those big ones that come in that are the problem, where people are kind of hitting into the buffer pool. It will go away if you don't pay for stocks. So, right, the reason you're involved in a carbon project is because you had 14 million credits given for the stocks that were out there initially, right? The reason that University of Montana is in an ARB project is that they were paid for stocks out there, something like 6 million credits first period right away. If you pull that out as we're doing it, and the payments are for the sequestration that you get, you're not incentivizing people to leave high stocks on the landscape. And high stocks doesn't necessarily correlate with high growth. It's flux, it's what you pull out of the atmosphere. So that's kind of what I was saying, moving into this next paradigm. It's how do you increase the growth? And the growth is also counting what you shove into products, right? And you don't treat products, what's the average over 100 years? That's the ARB method. Or what's left after 100 years, that's the ACR method. You treat it as what's out there. We're good at kind of managing that and measuring that. The signals are wrong. I think that's kind of where we need to head. And in areas where there are high fire, the University of Idaho probably get in trouble. We did talk about something on our school forests, and it was a no, in that we want to bring our stocks down because we're in a high fire risk area and because we were going to be doing pile burning and PCTs out there and have a lot of debris around. We're like, this is not for us. So I think if you set the rules right, if you treat fire risk a little better, you ignore the endemic stuff, you're looking at just the big stochastic events, you can create rules that incentivize actual improved forest management, more wood, more growth. But it hasn't happened yet, and I wouldn't look to the federal government for that. I would look at ACR and Vera and different registries and say, let's get this going on its own so it goes through an administration and kind of carries on to the next. I don't know if I answered in that kind of diatribe, but no? All right.
All right, it's a great discussion. Thank you, gentlemen. We appreciate your time. Thank you for coming and sharing your knowledge.